Drake's Hollow, Arizona. Population 2,500. The sign at the town entrance was faded, bullet holes punched clean through the metal. Drake's Hollow was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where the grocery store doubled as the town's gossip hub, and where trouble didn't come often. But when it did, it got handled fast. Most outsiders looked at it and saw just another dying town in the desert. That's what the cartel thought too. They had no idea they were walking into a goddamn war zone. Frank Tate sat behind the counter of the bunker, his small, dimly lit bar. His hands were rough, scarred, reminders of a lifetime spent in places far worse than this one. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. He had fought wars in the sand before. Now, he just wanted to serve cold drinks, keep his head down, and live out the rest of his years in peace. But peace? It never lasted long, especially not in a town like this. A town full of men like him. Veterans, Rangers, Marines, SEALs, Delta boys who had come home, put away their weapons, and traded them for plows, mechanic wrenches, and small businesses. But just because they weren't wearing uniforms anymore didn't mean they forgot how to fight, and the cartel was about to find that out the hard way. It started with strangers. 2 black SUVs rolled into town, slow and deliberate, like predators circling their prey. Men in pressed shirts, expensive watches, and dark sunglasses stepped out, their movements too smooth, their smiles too forced. They were Cartel. Frank knew it the second they walked into his bar. He wiped a beer glass, watching them from the corner of his eye as they took a seat at the bar. The taller one, slicked back hair, tattoos peeking out from his collar, smiled at him. "You the owner?" he asked, voice smooth, confident. Frank nodded. "Yeah." The man drummed his fingers against the counter. "Nice place. Quiet town." Frank said nothing. He had seen this routine before. Back in Iraq, when insurgents moved into villages, promising protection before they started cutting off heads. The man leaned in slightly. "We're businessmen. We like to invest in communities. You understand?" Frank met his gaze, eyes like stone. "We don't need your kind of investment." The man chuckled. "Come on, amigo," he said. "We're just trying to help." His partner, a stockier man with dead eyes, pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on the bar. Cash. A lot of it. "You take this," the first man continued, "and things go smooth. We keep the town safe. No trouble." Frank stared at the money. Then, without breaking eye contact, he slid the envelope back. "We don't need protection," he said slowly, "and we sure as hell don't need it from you." The cartel man's smile faltered for just a second. Then he sighed, standing up. "Think about it, viejo," he said, voice colder now. "We'll be back." The men left, and Frank knew. The fight had just begun. The next day, the first shot was fired, not in broad daylight, not in a way that would bring in federal heat. No, the cartel was smart, calculated. They worked in the shadows, in the places where no one was watching. That night, flames erupted on the east side of town. Bobby Ortega's ranch was burning. Frank was already out of his bar, shotgun in hand, before the first fire truck even got moving. By the time he got there, the barn was engulfed, horses whinnying in terror inside their stalls. Bobby, a former Marine who had served in Fallujah, stood outside, his fists clenched, his eyes burning hotter than the fire. The message was clear. The cartel wasn't asking anymore. Frank grabbed Bobby by the shoulder. "You know who did this?" Bobby spat on the ground. "Who the hell do you think?" Frank nodded, jaw tightening. It was time to gather the men. The next night, Frank called a meeting at his bar. They didn't need a sheriff's office. They didn't need a town hall. They needed a plan. Inside the bunker, 20 men stood around the old wooden tables, listening. Some were old, weathered, their backs still straight from decades of discipline. Some were young, fresh out of the service, looking for a new fight to wage. All of them, they were warriors. Frank set his shotgun on the table. "They're coming back," he said simply. "We all know it," Bobby added. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Silence. Then an old man with a gray beard leaned forward. "Same thing we did in the war," he said. "We hit 'em first." A slow nod spread around the room. Frank looked around. "All right then," he said, voice firm. "Let's remind these bastards who they're messing with." The veterans' plan, sniper positions. Two former Marine Scout snipers took up spots in the water tower and old grain silo, covering the town's main road. Road traps. A former Army engineer rigged spike strips and makeshift barricades at both entrances to the town. Firepower, everyone checked their weapons, cleaned their rifles, and loaded their magazines. Early warning system. The town's hunting dogs were let loose, roaming the outskirts, trained to bark at unfamiliar scents. Fake weak spots. They left a few areas unguarded, funneling the cartel into a kill zone. They didn't just plan to defend Drake's Hollow, they planned to wipe these bastards off the map. At midnight, the cartel came back. Black SUVs, heavily armed. They rolled into town like they owned the place. The lead car stopped in front of the bunker. The same slicked-back enforcer stepped out, his smile gone. This time, he had 10 gunmen behind him. Frank stepped out onto the bar's porch, shotgun in hand. The man grinned. "I warned you, viejo," he said. Frank sighed. "And I warned you." Then he nodded. From the rooftops, 2 sniper rounds cracked through the night. The first cartel gunman dropped. The second fell before he could even reach for his gun. Panic, chaos. The cartel had just walked into a trap, and the men of Drake's Hollow, they were just getting started. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin like humidity before a storm. The cartel thought this would be easy. They had rolled in like kings, expecting a quiet little town, too scared to fight back. Instead, they walked straight into hell. The first 2 cartel soldiers were already dead, their bodies crumpled on the asphalt, blood pooling beneath them. The snipers had taken them clean. The rest of the cartel's enforcers scattered, taking cover behind vehicles, doorways, and anything solid. The town? It wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with war. Frank Tate stood on the bunker's porch, shotgun resting against his shoulder as he watched the cartel scramble. His radio buzzed. 2 down, more moving in. Frank smirked. "Copy that." Then he turned his head slightly. "Let 'em have it, boys." And just like that, Drake's Hollow exploded. The ambushes triggered first wave. The cartel, panicked and disorganized, tried to regroup behind their SUVs. They never saw the explosives buried under the road. With a click of a detonator, the ground erupted beneath them, flipping 2 of their vehicles like soda cans. Fireballs lit up the night, and screams filled the air. Second wave. The cartel rushed for cover, but there was nowhere safe. 2 ex-Marines posted in the hardware store roof opened fire with semi-automatics, picking them off one by one. From the church tower, a former Army Scout sniper put a bullet through the driver of the last cartel truck. Final wave. A few of the cartel soldiers made it into the alleyways, thinking they could flank the town. That's when the veterans hit them from behind. Shotguns lit up the dark, knives found throats, and within seconds, it was over. The town had erased the first wave before they even had a chance to fire back. But Frank knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first test. The real battle, it was still coming. 20 miles south, in the desert, a convoy of heavily armed trucks barreled toward Drake's Hollow, the cartel's true force. Inside the lead vehicle, a man with a scar across his jaw lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke slowly. Raúl El Sicario Fuentes. El Cuchillo's right-hand man, and now, the new leader of this operation. He spoke into his radio, voice calm, controlled. "The first team is dead." Silence. Then, El Sicario smiled. "Kill everyone." The trucks accelerated. Back in Drake's Hollow, Frank listened to the radio chatter from their spotters outside of town. "Big convoy incoming," the sniper from the grain silo reported. "They're loaded for war." Frank tossed his cigar, crushing it under his boot. "Let's give 'em one." The town's veterans gathered, checking their weapons, securing body armor that hadn't seen combat in years. Frank's bar had turned into a command center, maps laid out, ammo stacked like a military outpost. The snipers repositioned, waiting for the next wave. The church bell rang, the old battle signal from their war days. The local ranchers blocked the back roads, cutting off any escape routes for the cartel. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a goddamn war. The first cartel vehicle roared into town, gunmen hanging off the sides, opening fire in all directions. But the veterans were ready. A former Army Ranger with an M240 machine gun fired from the hardware store roof, ripping through the first truck like paper. The next two vehicles hit spike strips, tires shredding, trucks flipping over. Molotov cocktails rained down from the rooftops, setting Cartel gunmen ablaze. El Sicario watched from a distance, seeing his men fall apart in minutes. He growled, grabbing his radio. "Fall back! Fall back!" But it was too late. The ex-Special Forces team led a charge from the alley, taking out the last of the cartel enforcers with shotguns and brutal hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, the cartel's second wave was gone, and standing in the middle of the blood-stained street was Frank Tate, shotgun in hand. He looked down at one of the wounded cartel men, coughing up blood. Frank knelt beside him, voice low. "You tell your boss," he growled, "that Drake's Hollow isn't for sale." The man nodded weakly before passing out. Frank exhaled, standing up. He knew what was coming next. El Sicario wouldn't back down. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. Midnight. The town is quiet. Too quiet. Frank and his men knew the cartel would be back for one last fight. This time, they wouldn't bring trucks. They'd come on foot, slipping through the darkness, hunting them down. The veterans dug in, setting tripwires, hidden explosives, and barricades around the town's last defenses. The women and children had been evacuated, sent to a safe house outside of town. The last of the ammo was distributed. The final fight was coming. Frank stood on the roof of the bunker, watching the hills. Then he saw them. Cartel hit squads, moving like shadows. At least 30 of them, fully armed, creeping toward town. Frank grabbed his radio. "They're here." The response was immediate. "Then let's end this." Frank loaded his shotgun, took a deep breath. "You boys ready?" A slow chuckle came from the radio. "You ever asked that dumb of a question in the Corps, Tate?" Frank smirked. "Let's send these bastards to hell." Drake's Hollow, 1:45 a.m. The town was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind of silence that came before violence. Frank Tate stood on the roof of the bunker, shotgun in hand, scanning the horizon. His breathing was slow, steady, the same way it had been when he was waiting for a firefight in Fallujah. Down below, the town was ready. 15 veterans armed to the teeth. No police, no feds, no backup. This was their fight, and this town wasn't going down easy. 30 cartel soldiers, heavy weapons, night vision gear, body armor, and silencers. El Sicario wasn't taking chances. He had already lost 2 waves of men. Now, he was coming personally. They moved through the shadows, spreading out through the town, coordinated, tactical, professional. But what they didn't realize, they weren't the only professionals here. Frank whispered into the radio. "Hold your fire." The cartel crept through the streets, weapons raised, scanning the rooftops, the alleys. They expected civilians. Instead, they were hunting ghosts. Then came the first shot. Crack. A cartel soldier's head snapped back, his body crumpling near the town's water tower. A perfect sniper kill. "One down," came the whisper from the rooftops. Frank smirked. The cartel had just realized they were in a war. The cartel rushed forward, trying to reach cover, but they stepped right into the trap. A hidden tripwire triggered a claymore mine, sending a wall of shrapnel through 3 men. 2 cartel gunmen sprinted behind a truck, only for the ex-Army Ranger behind them to unload a shotgun into their backs. A cartel grenadier tried to lob a grenade through a window, but before he could pull the pin, a .308 sniper round tore through his skull. Bodies dropped, blood hit the dirt, and the cartel finally understood. They weren't raiding a town, they were fighting trained killers. El Sicario gritted his teeth, grabbing his radio. "Vayan por los edificios, fuego en todas direcciones." Move through the buildings, fire everywhere. His men pushed into the town, using automatic fire to spray buildings, smash windows, force the defenders back. One veteran was hit, a round catching his shoulder, but he still emptied his shotgun into the man who shot him. A cartel soldier kicked in a door, only to be met with a revolver to the chest. Frank moved fast, switching positions, firing controlled bursts from his M4. Bam, bam, bam. 2 more cartel men dropped in the street, but they kept coming. The cartel had lost too many men, but El Sicario didn't care. He had one goal now: find Frank Tate, Kill him. End this. El Sicario and 5 of his men stormed the bunker, kicking in the doors. Frank barely had time to flip a table for cover before bullets ripped through the bar. Bottles exploded, glass shattered. Frank rolled behind the counter, reloading his rifle. Then, footsteps. El Sicario was coming. The final fight was here. Frank waited. His back was against the bullet-riddled bar counter, his breathing slow, controlled. Then, silence. He could hear the soft crunch of boots on broken glass. He could feel the presence of death creeping closer. Then, a figure stepped into the light. El Sicario, gold-plated pistol in one hand, a machete in the other. Blood smeared across his face like war paint. He smiled. "You fought hard, viejo." Frank stood up slowly, cracking his knuckles. "And you died stupid." El Sicario's smile disappeared. Then they moved. El Sicario fired first. Frank dodged right, feeling the bullet graze his ribs. He fired back, but El Sicario ducked behind a booth, hand-to-hand combat. El Sicario lunged, swinging the machete. Frank blocked with his rifle, the blade slicing through the gun stock. The fight turned brutal, raw, primal. Elbows, knees, fists, blood. They slammed into walls, overturned tables, broke chairs over each other's backs. Frank's vision blurred from the pain, but he kept moving. Then, El Sicario grabbed him by the throat, slamming him into the bar. Frank gasped, feeling the air leave his lungs. El Sicario raised the machete for the kill. Then, bam, a single gunshot. El Sicario froze. A red hole blossomed in his chest. Frank gasped for air, looking past his enemy. And there, standing in the wreckage, holding a smoking .45 revolver, was Sheriff Eli Brooks. El Sicario staggered, blood bubbling from his lips. Then he collapsed. It was over. The sun was rising over Drake's Hollow when the last of the cartel's survivors fled back into the desert. Bodies lay in the streets. Buildings were riddled with bullet holes, but the town still stood. Frank sat on the steps of the bunker, wiping blood from his face, as Sheriff Brooks walked up. The lawman sighed, holstering his revolver. "Jesus, Frank," he muttered. "You ever think about retiring for real?" Frank chuckled, lighting a cigar. "Nah," he said, exhaling smoke. "I'd get bored." Brooks shook his head. "You think they'll come back?" Frank took another slow drag, looking out at the bodies, the burning cartel trucks, the quiet, bullet-scarred town. "If they do," he said, grinning, "we'll be ready." 2 weeks later, Drake's Hollow was rebuilding, and the cartel, they never came back. Some say it was because the cartel feared retaliation from the US government. Others say it was because they knew the truth. This wasn't just some town. It was a fortress of warriors, and anyone who came for it never left. The sun had yet to rise, but the night no longer held its quiet grip over Drake's Hollow. The smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, mingling with the smoke curling from burning trucks on the outskirts of town. The battle had raged for hours, but Frank Tate knew this wasn't over. Not yet. He stood at the entrance to the bunker, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, his knuckles bruised and bloodied. His breathing was steady, but his muscles ached, screaming in protest from the night's firefight. The town had fought back harder than the cartel could have ever imagined, but the enemy was still out there. He could feel it. Sheriff Brooks limped up beside him, pressing a rag to his temple where a bullet had grazed him earlier in the night. His uniform was soaked in dust and sweat, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the wreckage like a man waiting for the next storm. "You think they're really gone?" Brooks asked, voice rough from shouting orders all night. Frank shook his head. "Number? They're waiting. Regrouping." He reached for a cigarette and lit it with steady fingers. "El Sicario doesn't strike me as the type to cut and run. If he's still breathing, he's planning something." As if summoned by Frank's words, the radio crackled to life inside the bar, a voice coming through, breathless and panicked. "We got movement south of town," the lookout reported. "A convoy. Big one. They're coming back." Frank exhaled smoke through his nose, flicking the cigarette away. "Of course they are," he muttered. Brooks let out a curse under his breath. "You think they got more men?" "They wouldn't be coming back if they didn't," Frank said. "But they're done playing. They're pissed. That means they're going to come in with everything they've got." He turned toward the group of veterans who had gathered around him, their weapons still warm from the last fight. "We've already sent 2 messages tonight. This one's gotta be the last." A slow murmur of agreement passed through the men, their faces grim. These weren't soldiers anymore, not officially, but war had a way of calling back those who knew it best. And Frank knew, without a doubt, that when the cartel arrived this time, they wouldn't be leaving. The night stretched longer than it should have, like time itself was waiting for the inevitable clash. Frank moved between the barricades that had been hastily set up along the main road, checking ammunition, repositioning men, reinforcing weak spots. They had to be smart now. The first ambush had worked because the cartel hadn't expected a fight. This time, they'd be prepared. Bear trotted at Frank's heels, ears perked, nose twitching at the air. The dog knew something was coming too. The instincts of a soldier lived in him just as much as they did in the men standing guard around town. The radio crackled again, and this time, the voice was calmer but sharper. They're about a mile out, 2 trucks, some SUVs, and something bigger. Frank's grip on his rifle tightened. "What do you mean, bigger?" The lookout hesitated. "Looks like some kinda armored vehicle. Not military, but reinforced. Plated with steel, probably a battering ram up front." Frank exhaled through his nose. "They're done knocking." He turned back to his men. "All right, listen up. They're rolling in heavy. This ain't gonna be like last time. They're bringing an armored truck, so we need to funnel them into a kill zone before they get close enough to flatten half the damn town." He pointed to the explosives that had been hastily refilled in the road. "We let them come as close as possible before we blow that charge. If it doesn't stop them, we light up that truck with everything we've got. We stop it, we control the fight. If we don't," he shook his head, "we're dead." The men nodded, adjusting their grips on their weapons, their eyes shifting toward the road, waiting, ready. Then the sound came. Engines, loud, coming fast. Frank knelt behind cover, shotgun resting on his knee. He could see the glow of headlights cutting through the dust, the rumble of tires shaking the ground beneath them. The cartel was coming, and they weren't stopping. The lead SUV tore into town first, its headlights sweeping across the abandoned buildings, the empty streets. They thought the town was scared, that the fight had been bled out of them. They didn't realize they had walked into another trap. Frank waited. Now, he pressed the detonator. The road erupted. A column of fire shot into the sky as the first SUV was lifted off its wheels, flipping in midair before crashing onto its roof. The truck behind it slammed on its brakes, but it was too late. Gunfire rained down from the rooftops, bullets tearing through windshields, punching through doors. The cartel soldiers inside barely had time to react before they were cut down. But the armored truck? That thing didn't stop. It came barreling through the smoke, its steel-plated front grille catching the firelight like a beast charging through hell. The mounted gunner on top opened fire, sending a wave of bullets tearing through the storefronts, forcing Frank's men to scatter. The truck was getting too close. Frank stood, bracing his shotgun. He aimed for the windshield, fired. The slug bounced off the reinforced glass. "God damn it," he muttered. Then, from the side of the street, an old voice barked, "Duck!" Frank barely hit the ground before the whoosh of a rocket launcher streaked overhead. The RPG slammed into the side of the armored truck, exploding on impact. The beast of a machine skidded sideways, flames curling along its hull. The gunner up top was flung from his seat, hitting the pavement with a sickening crunch. Frank turned, seeing old Mitch Daniels, a Vietnam vet, lowering the smoking RPG launcher. The man grinned. Knew keeping this thing would pay off someday. The town erupted with gunfire again, as the last of the cartel men tried to retreat. But Drake's Hollow wasn't letting them leave. One by one, the gunmen fell, their bodies sprawled across the bloody dirt road. By the time the last shot echoed into silence, the town stood victorious. The cartel was gone. Frank stood in the center of it all, smoke curling from the end of his shotgun. His men slowly emerged from their positions, scanning the bodies, checking each other for wounds. Sheriff Brooks walked up beside him, wiping the blood from his face with a rag. "Think that's the last of them?" Frank took a long breath, looking at the wreckage, the bodies, the town still standing behind them. He nodded. "Yeah, that's the last of them." Brooks exhaled. "Good." The first streaks of sunrise began to break over the desert, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The battle for Drake's Hollow was over, and the town had won. For good. A week later, Frank sat outside the bunker, a cold beer in his hand, watching the town rebuild. The scars of the fight were still there. Bullet holes in buildings, scorch marks in the dirt. But the people, they were still here, and that was what mattered. Amy walked up beside him, arms crossed. So, what now? Frank took a slow sip of his beer, watching the people he fought for, the men who stood beside him. If they come back, he said, setting his drink down, we'll be ready. Amy smirked. Damn right. And as the town of Drake's Hollow carried on, Frank knew one thing for certain. Some places weren't meant to be taken. Some towns weren't meant to fall. And some men, they never stopped fighting. The end. Hope you have enjoyed yourself, and don't have a good day, have a great day.